What is a Chasid?
I remember being a boy, a bacharel, and then a bacher in Oil Chana Chabad in Los Angeles, and we had Yarchei Kale. The yeshiva made for a week where Balabatim came to learn. Some would come only for Sunday for the weekend. Some came taka for the whole week. And it was an environment of learning in yeshiva where Balabatim came. Because of the Yarchei Kale, the yeshiva invited speakers from other places, rabbis and lay people and other kind of public servants to deliver addresses to enrich the week. And more than once I remember this, but one person in particular, Rabbi Ezra Shachat was introduced him, and he said that this man is a philosopher, a big professor, and said, but he's also a chassid. And that's what's unique about him, that he's a philosopher, he's an intellectual, he's well educated, and he's in the business of academia, and at the same time he's a chassid. So we got up to speak, and his first words were, I try. I heard this the first time when I was probably 15 and a half. And I remember the impact that it had on me. You introduce somebody as a chassid, and he says, I try. I think there's nothing more emblematic or symptomatic of a chassid than the idea, I try. Or to use the old adage, the moment someone is a complete chassid, they're completely a non-chassid. Nis Nemenov always worried about becoming a fartiker, being complete. You have to constantly be a work in progress, which is part of the foundation of what a chassid is. Having said that, this of course is a long, long conversation if you so desired. And if anybody's interested, is actually in the previous Rebbe Siches. When he first came to America in the spring of 1940, there's a long Siche where he asks the questions very upfront. Was is a chassid and was is chassidus? What is a chassid and what is each one separately? And he has a lengthy discussion on each. You read those early siches and you realize when the previous Rebbe came to America, it was almost like it was resetting the whole chassidus, starting from the beginning and explaining all of the fundamentals. And this is one of the very first questions that he asked here in America, what is a chassid and what is chassidus? And he proceeded to explain each. One of the episodes that are related regarding the question of what is a chassid is this, that in Tofresh Mem Vov Mem Zayin, the Rebbe Rashab was traveling in what's famous in the Lubavitch world as Masa Yalta, which is described in the Rishimus HaMaiser. And they were coming back from their stay in Yalta, which is on the Black Sea, I guess, in Crimea, I believe. And they stopped in the city of Kharkiv for a Lag Boimer Fabrengen. After the Fabrengen, there was a discussion between the previous Rebbe, who was 6 or 7, or 5 or 6, almost 6, almost 7, with several of the Elter Chassidim. And the previous Rebbe asked them what their father discussed with them. Now remember, the Rebbe Rashab was all of 25, and the Chassidim he was talking to could have been twice his age. But nevertheless, he was Tsarski Mishpacha, a young man from Tsarski Mishpacha. He was Rebbe, and they were Chassid. And they told the previous Rebbe that the Rebbe Rashab, his father, had discussed with them, what is a chassid? What is a chassid? So the previous Rebbe said proudly, this is how he tells the story, and me, my father told 6 months ago. You just found out what a chassid is. My father told me 6 months ago what a chassid is. So they smiled, one of them smiled, and he said to him, Dira de tate gesagt, was a chassid is. Your father told you what a chassid with a lamed is. Unser de tate gesagt, was is a chassid. We were told what a chassid is. Now, of course, the purpose of telling the story is to establish the idea that there's a lot of levels in chassid. And one chassid compared to another chassid is chassidl. A little chassid compared to a big chassid is a chassid, and a small chassid is a chassid and a lamed. It's a completely different idea. Then there's a third story, which is fantastic, that the previous Rebbe tells, that he heard from his father, the Rebbe Rashab. He may have also heard it from Yagamata Paltava, the Paltava Rav, that there was a Fabrengen during the lifetime of the Rebbe Marash, B'chaim Chayosei B'al Madena, the Rebbe Marash of Chassidim. And the Rebbe Rashab was not an oft participant in Fabrengens of Chassidim. He said himself, Ich hab nicht gehabt Zeit, was Arum Chassidus is. The Rebbe Rashab said, I never had the time for what is around Chassidus because I was busy with Chassidus itself. But there was this Fabrengen where the Rebbe Rashab participated, and the question on the table is, what is a Chassid? What's a Chassid? And there were a number of answers. The Rebbe Rashab, who was 15 or 16 at the time, said that the meaning of the word Chasid is eine was ist zugebunden zum Rebbe, someone who's connected to the Rebbe, and he added zugebunden to the Pu'ules from Rebbe. Being connected to the Rebbe means being connected to the activities, to the pro-actions, what the Rebbe is busy with. Other Hasidim gave much more profound answers, much more prayer-centric or Avodah-centric answers, but this is what the Rebbe Rashab said. When this conversation ended, there was no consensus. They still argued. So it was decided that they would bring it to the Rebbe Marash. But they wouldn't tell the Rebbe who said what. They would simply present it as a Mara Mechade or Mara Mechade and let the Rebbe Marash resolve it for them. So they came to the Rebbe Marash and they presented him with various of the proposals that were suggested. And when the Rebbe Marash heard this, and of course they didn't tell him it was his son who said it, that a Chassid is someone who's connected to his Rebbe, and specifically connected to the Rebbe's activities, the practical things of the Rebbe Marash commented, Das hat gesagt hat tief im Pnimi. Whoever said this was a deep theme. In other words, Chassidus had become really his. Why? What's the pshat? The pshat is, we all understand that Chassidus is a spiritual thing. Chassidus is not about doing a mitzvah. Although in the Lashon HaShas, the Rebbe brings, it says in a Yem Yem that Chassid is an ancient term. In Lashon HaShas, Chassid is Lefnim Yishur Zadin, Chassid Seir Fun. But when we use the word Chassid, we're referring to something very spiritual. And therefore, the idea that Chassid comes down to doing what your Rebbe says practically seems to be inconsistent with the spirit of Chassidus and Chassid. And that's why the Rebbe Marash says it's the end of it, it's the point of it all. The point of all the spirituality is the Maisa B'Peil, is the proactivity. And I suppose the best way, or the simplest way, the most direct way, for me to articulate this is to tell you another story. There was another Chassid, I believe it's Yakamata Paltiel, who hadn't slept in a bed for 30 years. He exhausted his body. And he was dying. And he wasn't very old. Because how much duress, how much stress he's put on his body as a servant of HaKadosh Baruch. As he lay on his deathbed, he said, I would give away 30 years of Avodah to put film on one more time. He knew that he would not live to see the morning and put film on again. He said, I give away all the last 30 years of beating up my body to put film on one more time. When this comment reached the Rebbe Rashab said, is gerecht. He's absolutely right. But you don't know this unless you beat up your body for 30 years. In other words, the idea that the deepest thing is action is known to the deepest chassid. The chassid who has such a profound, such a correct sense of spirituality, that he's achieved a place where he got to the end of spirituality, and that the end of spirituality is that the Eibishter wants a mitzvah, and in a mitzvah of Atzmas and Hus is the ultimate chassid. And this is the pshat of what the Rebbe Rashab said, connected to the Rebbe, and he added the term to the pulas for them, to the activities of the Rebbe. And one final idea I'm going to share, which is in that very Sikha, in Sefer Sichas Tav Shin, where the Rebbe Rashab himself told the previous Rebbe that he did, I guess, a survey, if you can use that word, asking Chassidim, who he respected very much, was is a chassid? And one of the chassid who was considered a Shem Dov, one of the most famous, one of the most distinct chassidim in that era, was a chassid by the name of Rabbi Wolf. Rabbi Wolf's last name was Kozevnikov. There's a picture of him in Talston film. Rabbi Wolf Kozevnikov is called Rabbi Wolf Katrinislav. He was the Rav in Yekaterinoslav in Dnepr Petrovsk before the Rebbe's father, before the Leivik. He died, he passed away, and his seat became vacated, empty, and the Rebbe Rashab fought very hard that another chassid, namely Rebbe Leivik, should take his place as the Rav Yekaterinoslav. This Rebbe Wolf told the Rebbe Rashab asked him, what's his chassid? And the Rebbe Rashab told the Rebbe Rashab the following story. That when he was very young, he stuttered so terribly he could barely put words together. Now, a person was difficult with communication, becomes an introvert, and he was a genius. He sat and learned day and night. He became a great Talmud Chacham. He was a big Chasid, a big Gaon, a big Lamden and Ovid and Maskell, all good as in the city where he lived, and of course it says in the Sikh all the details, I just don't remember them. There were a group of young men who were still single, unmarried, who were not learning, they were working for their families and so on, and they had a lot of spare time, which is a terrible thing. So the Avodah made like the equivalent of a Teferes Bachurim that they have later. He would gather them together and learn with them, a shir, a hin, a shir, a head, daven with them. It was very difficult for him to speak, but he exerted himself and he became an influence on this group of young Alite. Then he was in Lubavitch by the Tzemach Tzedek for Yechidus. When he came into the Tzemach Tzedek seemed to be very happy with him. And the Tzemach Tzedek asked him what he does. He started to describe his schedule and his learning and his davening. And Tzemach Tzedek kept on saying, no, what else do you do? What else do you do? He didn't think much. He didn't think it was a big deal, the fact that he was being makar of these bachrim. He was giving a little time to save some souls, big deal. And the Tzemach Tzedek pressed him. Until finally he ran out of things to tell the Tzemach Tzedek. So by default he said, listen, I have this little group of guys who are working and they're not in yeshiva and they're still single and I'm nice to them and I fabring with them. And the Tzemach Tzedek's face radiated. He was so happy. And the Tzemach Tzedek told him, Psach picha v'ya'irud v'lecha, open your mouth and your words will shine. And he gave him moedendike brachas. The Avodah never stuttered again in his life. And he became one of the most famous orators in all of Russia. One of the most famous public speakers in all of Russia was this man who couldn't put two sentences together. And the Avodah told the Rebbe Rashab, based on his personal experience, and how the Tzemach Tzedek responded, Vos is a Chasid, Eine vos is Deiresh Teves Ulasi. A Chasid is somebody who seeks the benefit to put somebody else ahead of himself. So I don't know if I answered the question, and maybe we can rephrase the question and create another context to continue this conversation, but I certainly provided much food for thought.